Let's get started because it's time. So, sprinkle vast greatness into your images. Yes, I make funny, not so funny puns and weird name things. But we're going to talk about how to actually, because most of us are familiar with SVGs and have used them at some point. The thing is, a lot of times we're doing very little with what the full breadth of the power that we have and of the things we can do with them. So in this talk, we're going to kind of go over some things as to not only what an SVG is, what the code looks like and how the code works, and then we'll finish it off with how to get some interaction inside of it and some of the accessibility concerns that come along with that. So for this specific presentation, I'm actually going to be using one example throughout most of it. And a little bit about me, I'm a UX UI developer. My name is Martine, for those who don't know me. And I love fall, and I'm ready for it to be fall. So a good chunk of our examples are going to be based upon a sample web page for a pumpkin soup recipe. Because I am tired of the heat, I am tired of summer, I'm tired of the bugs. It is time for fall. So that is what we're going to be doing most of our examples around today. So an SVG, that stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. So what is it? If you think of your PNGs, your JPEGs, all of those kind of images, those are raster, which means you literally have little squares, and they give you, each square is assigned a color, it's pixel-based, and that all of the individual pixels compose the image. The vector, however, which is what our SVGs are, they're mathematical formula. They are basically you're looking at lines, curves, circles. So you're never dealing with individual pixels. So that gives us some big advantages. For example, a raster, if the original image, which is the one all the way to the left over here, is only 100 pixels, if I tried to blow it up bigger than that, you'll get pixelation, right? You can't invent more pixels. Now, I know Photoshop has created some algorithms to try to, do smart objects that you can actually increase the size of without it pixelating by doing some fancy schmancy math behind the scenes. But if you don't have a program like that to recalculate it for you, you're going to end up with pixelation. A vector, however, out of the box, it doesn't matter because you're simply increasing and decreasing the size of the formula, right? So you're just recalculating for that size. You're never actually having to figure out numbers of pixels, which means you could take this star and blow it up the size of a billboard, and it would still be perfectly crisp, perfectly identical to how you see it now. You wouldn't have any distortion or pixelation issues. So that is one of the really cool things about SVGs is no matter how big or how small you need your image to be, it's just going to always work. So what does it look like underneath the covers? If I open an SVG file inside of my code editor, I get something like this. And so this is some quite complicated code in the grand scheme of things. So let's break it down and can kind of figure out what this all means, because as we want to add interactions into our SVGs, as we want to start adding bells and whistles into them, we're going to start needing to understand what all this means so that we can know where to look for things. So first thing is the view box. At the very top in our SVG tag is going to be this thing, view box, and it's going to have 4 numbers in it. And what that basically does is it tells you where the image is going to start, where X and Y coordinates, followed by the height and the width. So that gives the ratio of the image. Especially if I were to play with the width and the height, that's how I could skew my SVG, for example. The other thing about it, for the 0, 0, that's where basically every SVG underneath has a coordinate plane that we're going to be interacting with. That's how we're going to set things. That's where we're going to decide where things lie. So that 0, 0 basically says those first 2 numbers, that min X and min Y, that's that top left-hand corner of your coordinate plane. We then are going to have a number of functions that are basically going to be there. And so those can be shapes. there's a number of shapes that are already pre-baked in for us. There's the rectangle, which is going to take an X and a Y. That's where the rectangle starts. So I'm going to get the little cursor pointer thing. So this X and this Y right here amounts to this X and Y corner over here. And so from there, we're going to give it a width, which in this case is 40, and a height, and which in this case is 20. Then you can do some stylistic things. You can also add some CSS here. But in order to define the shape, it's always going to be starting at the top left and then building it from there. Circles work very similarly. They're going to take a CX, which is the center point, a CY, and then an R, which is your radius. So basically, we're saying the center of my circle is at 20, 30. So X 20, Y 30. And we're going to go ahead and have a radius of 40, which means that my circle is going to be 40 wide. And then we can do a stroke if we want. Or again, we can add as much as CSS and styling as we want. Notice, however, that basically when we're talking about SVGs, everything is the equivalent of positioned absolute. So that's going to kind of run into some issues later down the road when it comes to accessibility. That as you place things on your SVG, whatever the last thing that's going to get placed is going to be on top. But everything is positioned absolute on this coordinate plane that exists behind every SVG. The ellipse works very similarly to the circle. And what it does is, again, you're going to have your X and your Y, which is where your CX and your CY, which is where you're going to start your ellipse. And then you're going to give it an X radius and a Y radius. So your X radius is where the ellipse, how tall the ellipse is going to be. So radius versus diameter, right? Quick geometry recap. Diameter is all the way, radius is half. So from the center to the top or from the center to the bottom, that's going to be your X radius and then your Y radius. And then the ellipse will get drawn around those things. And again, style as you please. Line. Now this is where I often use the analogy of an Etch-a-Sketch when it comes to SVGs, because what we're going to do with the line is we're going to tell it where it starts and where it ends, and it's going to draw a line in between. So if we say we're going to start at x equals 10, y equals 10, that's here, and we're going to tell it you're going to end at x equals 30, y equals 50. So you're going to end down here. And then it's going to automatically draw the line. So for straight lines, which is what line does, essentially you're just giving it where you start, where you end, and it's going to draw the line. If we want more complex lines, so we have the polyline, in which case that's where the real Etch-a-Sketch game starts, because you're going to tell it my first point is at 10, 10. Then you're going to, in the commas, this is kind of a pain in the butt to read because your commas don't separate. Now, this is your x comma y, and so on. So it's because of that, it makes it kind of hard to read sometimes because you're naturally wanting to pick these 2 points as a point instead of the x comma y. So beware of that when you're reading your stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to start at 10, 10. We're going to go to 20, 20. We're going to go to 20, 30. And we're going to go to 30, 30. And we can continue on like that, just like an Etch-a-Sketch forever. But you're never going to be able to lift up your point and start again. Like once you on a polyline, then be it. As long as you keep on giving it points, it's going to continue to draw. Right? The polygon is essentially a polyline, but wherever those last 2 points are, it's going to finish itself. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start at 10, 10, 20, 20, 20, 30, 30, 30. 40, 20, and 30, 10. But notice I didn't give it any instruction to close, yet it does close. And that's the difference between polyline and polygon. If I could give it the exact same instructions on a polyline and it would omit this last piece. But because it's a polygon, it's going to go and basically rejoin whatever this first point was. And then we have the path. By far and away the most common piece used in SVGs, because you can do a lot of things with paths. So the first thing you're going to do when you're creating a path is you've got your path, and then you've got your D, which is where your definition for the path is going to come in. So N is basically where you're telling your Etch-a-Sketch or your SVG, take your pencil and put it down at this particular point. That is my starting point. Then L stands for line. So if I tell it, I want you to draw a line, and then I give it a set of points, so it's going to be line 1020, I'm going down. So I started here, it knows I started here, so I only have to give it a second point because I've already got my first point, and I'm telling it I want you to draw a line to my second point. So it already knows that, so 1020. We can draw curves. Curves end up having, so curves are usually going to be based on the Bezier curve. So it can be a simple Bezier curve, a cubic, quadratic, or you can string multiple Bezier curves together. Bezier curves is also, for those who are not quite familiar with them, are the same things you're going to use when you're trying to do animation curves for your timing. That's the same math that you're going to use for that. Essentially what you end up having is you have these two extensions right here that define what your curve is going to look like. So you're going to, for a curve in this case, I'm giving it T40, I've given it, so C, I'm doing a standard Bezier, and I'm telling it 1040, 4040, and 4020, which are basically, I'm giving it, here's my 1040, I'm telling it where this first extension is, I'm telling it where my second extension is, and then where my curve ends. So it's C1, C2, C3. And from that, it will know how to draw the curve. Bezier curves are something where I could write an entire talk on how to do them. Don't worry, I will show you tricks on how to not have to be in math hell for doing SVGs. The other thing you can do are arcs. In this case, the arcs are going to take the Rx and Ry, so our radius in X and our radius in Y, very similar to what we were doing with the circles and the ellipses. Then we're going to go ahead and take the axis rotation. So that is, are we going, which direction are we going on? Are we telling it to draw the curve going this way? Oops, sorry. Going to the right or to the left? And then the large arc flag, which is basically, do we want this to be, do we want it to go the long way around or the short way around while it's drawing? And then the flag sweep, which is where it's going to go. Are we going right? And with all those numbers, you get a nice pretty curve. And then you get the X and Y, which is where you want your curve to end. And it auto-calculate your pretty fun stuff. The likelihood of you guys ever writing your curves by hand is very, very small, so don't worry about it. And lastly, we have Z. Z is awesome because Z says, wherever in the world you are, I want you to close my shape. And to close my shape, it's going to basically join your Z and your N, which is where you basically drop your pencil. Any questions on that? Because I know that's a whole lot very, very quickly. Yeah? Okay. So, what about those super complex SVGs? Because if you're having to write this, you're probably not very happy with yourself. I wouldn't be, and I don't do it. And I love SVGs, and I still don't do it. What I do is I use a pretty little program called Illustrator. Yes, polygons with holes and islands. What you can do is, because on paths you have this endpoint, what you can do is you can actually, unlike a lot of the other shapes, is you can basically tell it, hey, pick up your pencil and move it over here and then start over again. So that's how you're going to do your complex paths. Does that make sense? So Illustrator is our friend. If you do not want to pay for a license for Illustrator, here are some open source options. I've used GIMP and Inkscape in the past, although it's been a really long time. I have not vetted these last three, although a number of articles about labeled something along the lines of alternate to Illustrator we're suggesting these as options. So feel free to try them. I do enough graphics that I just pay for the license for Illustrator. But it is up to you to use what you want. It will make your life a whole lot easier because most of these programs will be able to export your SVG already pre-made for you. And then as we add stuff to it, we can go edit the code rather than having to write it from scratch. Because I'm sorry, if you ask me tomorrow to draw this particular image that I have here on the screenshot by hand, it would be a massive headache, and it is not something that I would want to do or otherwise probably be capable of doing by that. So we have our pretty SVG, and we're going to put it on the web. What is going to happen to us now? Well, we have a couple options to get it there in the first place. The first one is to use an image tag. SVG is, after all, an image, so we can use an image tag. The thing with that is it's got great browser support. Image tag has been supported across browsers for quite some time. You will want an alt tag at least. You can put a title tag on it. But for accessibility purposes, you do want to make sure you have alternate text there if it is contextual in nature. You will get your browser hashing, you get gzip compression, it will get indexed. You will not be able to interact with it though. It will, if you have it as an image tag, it will be treated as an image tag. The other thing is if you have web fonts inside of there and you keep your information as text and you do not expand those to be shapes, it will not know the web font. So unless the user has that font loaded on their machine, you'll get whatever default is on their machine and not the web font you are planning for them to see. So beware of that when using image tag. But other than that, it's a great option. If you need interactivity, what you have is you can use the object tag. The object tag, you need to give it a type. So in this case it's going to be image slash SVG plus XML, because after all, inside of our SVG, it's XML is what the code is. And you're going to basically tell it the data, which is a link to your image, right, path to your image. And then you're going to do, and I'm sorry, I just noticed I put different paths on my images. What you're going to want is you're going to want to do a fallback. And the reason you're going to want to do a fallback is twofold. One, in case somebody is using an older browser that does not support object, although at this point the browser support is fairly good unless you're dealing with maybe some old versions of IE. The other reason is because search engines will not index the image. If you want your image to be indexed, you need to be able to have that as an image tag in there. So it serves both purposes. The good news is though, is that as much as this is going to force a double load of the image is going to get pulled back twice. But since you're getting full caching ability on both, it should be getting pulled from cache. So it really depends on what your needs are, but I highly recommend going ahead and putting in that fallback. Does that make sense? Our third option is inline SVGs. This is going to get you the fastest loading speed and the most interactivity. As much as with the object, if you have clickable elements inside of your SVGs and hovers and stuff, it will totally work. But you will not be able to edit the behavior of inside of the SVG based on things happening outside of your SVG. In this case, you will. So for example, I can, because it's inline, I can control based on a hover on an anchor tag, the color of the rectangle inside of my SVG, right? I can actually pass through, because the SVG has its own DOM and HTML has its own DOM, and those two you can pass to and fro when you have it inline. You can get into there. Otherwise, if you're using object or if you're using image, that's a black box to you. So if you want to be able to interact with things, for things outside of your SVG to be able to interact with things inside of your SVG and vice versa, if you want those two to be able to know and communicate and talk to each other, you have to have it inline. Obviously, because it's not an image, you're not going to be gzipping. I mean, you might be gzipping your HTML file, in which case it's going to get gzips in that context. You're not going to get browser caching in that case. And the alt text you don't need because it's not necessarily an image. The cool thing here is if you have text, it'll read it just fine. You're going to get your browser support is really, really good. And it's definitely the fastest on the load speed of what we've seen so far. So side by side, basically it depends on what you're trying to do. If you just want an image where you don't have to worry about the image size, image tag is perfectly fine, you're great, but there's no interaction. Object is great if you don't necessarily need to have it interact with what's going on outside of itself. The advantage of having it there is if you have a particularly complex SVG, that's a metric butt ton of code. So if you don't need it to interact with what's going on outside, it's nice because it keeps the code somewhere else in its own little file, neatly, separation of concerns type thing, makes for being able to maintain that a lot nicer. However, it is the slowest of the three in terms of load time. And finally, inline, the fastest, but it does clutter up your code a little bit because not everything is in your HTML. But in terms of interactivity, that's going to be your best bet. So picking one of those three is in order of how you're wanting to do your SVGs. And it's not necessarily one size fits all, right? You may have some things that you pull in as an image tag, some things that you pull in line. It really depends. There's three other options that we need to talk about. Embed, it's deprecated and or has been removed from most modern browsers. It has some history with Flash and whatnot. Do not use it. It's not going to work out for you. Just kind of forget it ever existed. Iframes are really bad for SEO, accessibility, maintenance. If you think you need an iframe, just use an object instead. You'll get much better results and achieve the same thing that you were going for. Last but not least is background image. Background image is absolutely wonderful. It works great. You basically gives you the same kind of situation as with an image tag. There is no interaction at that point. It is simply getting treated as an image, end of story. But it's getting all of the benefits that you were getting from image in terms of caching, in terms of load time, etc. Any questions about how to import SVGs? Moving on. So we've got our SVGs. We know how we're going to import them. And now we go on the World Wide Web and see what happens. So this is, remember how I said I loved fall, and fall was my favorite season. And we're going to do pumpkin soup thing. This is basically the basis for what we're going to be working with. So all of the examples will be based around this page, and at the end we'll do a little demo and show you how it all works together. But this is kind of the idea, where we have a sidebar, and then we have links to with various ingredients attached to them, and then we have some sort of instructions that apparently have a spelling mistake in them. But we'll ignore that because that's not what it's about. Okay, so the first thing you do is you decide you want a bunch of interactivity. So you're going to pull in your SVGs, and you're going to realize that they look all messed up, and that you're blowing up errors all inside of your console. And because when you generate your SVGs using something like Illustrator or some of the others, GIMP or Inkscape or whatever, they have their standard pattern that they're going to use. And they're going to use the same IDs on everything, and they're going to use the same class names for everything. So now you've got collisions between your IDs and your class names. This is going to be, this is not going to be true in terms of pulling it in as an image or as an object. Or as a background image. This is going to be true if you put it in line. So if you're planning on using your stuff in line, what you're going to want to do is go through all of those files and make sure that you're changing those class names and those ID names, or just removing the IDs if you don't need them, in order to make sure that you're not going to get collisions between your name spacing and whatnot. Yep. So then you decide you're going to put in some animations, because animations are fun. And then once you get your animations, you'll notice here on the right, the animation bleeds outside of my SVG. Oops. So the reason that happens is because our view box for our SVG is basically the size of that, is the size of our image. And once we scale everything, since we're scaling to 1.5, as you can see over here in my keyframes. Is everybody familiar with keyframes? Okay, is anybody not familiar with keyframes? Let's ask for it that way. So we have some people that are not. Okay, so I will do a quick on keyframes. So what keyframes allow us to do is create an animation. And so from that animation, we're going to tell it at such percent of my animation, I want you to have this behavior. At X percent of my animation, I want you to have this behavior. And at this percent, this behavior. So it works with the animation tag, in which case you're going to, the animation tag then, or the animation property that you're going to set in your CSS is going to say the name of the animation, which in this case I've named it scale potato. And then you're going to give it a time. So you're going to say this whole entire bit is going to run in so many milliseconds or seconds. And then it's going to be, and then you're going to be able to give it a timing function, which determines is it going to start slow and increase in speed, or be the same speed all the way down, or shorter, or start fast and then slow down. And then you're going to tell it how many times it decides to run. So what happens here is, based on that, I'm telling it about halfway through my animation, I want you to take my, whatever I've set this on, so in this case, my potatoes, and I want you to scale my potato to be 1.5 size larger than it was before. Now, when we're using transform doesn't actually scale the element inside of the normal flow of the page. It actually takes that element as if it was positioned absolute and expands it without moving everything around it and without affecting what is around it. So that's why now we're not pushing anything, we're just pushing overflow. And that's why we're bleeding outside of our view box. So remember how with our animation, when it's at 0, that's 50% and back to 0. So when it's at 0, we're perfectly fine. But as soon as we increase our size, our potatoes are now bigger than our view box. And that's problematic. So what we can do in order to fix that is do an overflow visible, because that means that this view box doesn't actually change, but it will go ahead and show what is outside of our view box. And that's because the transform, that's what I was explaining with the transform and the overflow. It doesn't actually move anything, it just bleeds outside of its overflow. So now we fixed our potatoes, yay! Our potatoes are now working correctly and animating correctly. So then what we're going to do is we're going to try to take, and this is a cool little CSS trick, is we're going to take our text, and notice how our text follows the shape of our sat nav. We're going to make it do that. And so in order to make it do that, we're going to use the CSS property shape outside. So shape outside, along with clip path. So shape outside determines the shape it's going to take, and then clip path determines that you're hiding everything that is not following the shape. That way it actually forms it into the shape. And when you use that in conjunction with float, you get your text to follow along with it. The problem is that clip path will take our URL like a champ, and it'll work perfectly, but not shape outside. It will give you a 404, and it'll give you a can't find, and on a different day or a different browser, it'll give you a CORS error, and on a different day, it'll give you some other red herring. The point is, it's a security thing, and so you have to have it served up over HTTPS. So notice over here, I have it on localhost, not working. You have to have it over HTTPS. As soon as you do that, it'll work just fine. So now that I've hosted my image for shape outside, it goes ahead and does its thing because I have my border, I floated it, and now my text comes and follows my neat little shape right here. Because basically I've said that this image has this shape, I've established the shape, and then clip path, I've told it, you know what, anything that doesn't follow within this shape, I want you to go ahead and pretend it doesn't exist. Shape margin is also pretty cool. It determines how close this stuff is going to end up to the image. What's the support on clip path and shape outside? It's actually not terrible. Let me pull up Can I Use, because I do not have a slide for that. That's flowy, that's not helpful, but that's okay. Shape, outside. So it's not terrible, because it's even better than the last time I checked. So right here, right now, it's basically in step, anything except for IE, the usual. And clip path. The path is not quite as good. Not quite as good. And most of it is related to partial support refers only to supporting URL. So clip path can also be done using shapes by putting the shape in directly instead of putting an image URL. And so so you can, the same way we were writing shapes for SVGs, you can write shapes like that in CSS, and those are much more widely supported than the URL at this time. Does that make sense? So it's very much experimental. It's probably something you would want to do as a progressive enhancement, not so much as a main feature. All right, transform origin. So when we do a transformation in SVG, in CSS, sorry, if we take the entire SVG and I say I want to rotate you, what happens is it starts by default at the center and it rotates all the way around from the center. And that's how you basically all of CSS works. You can move that center point and say, I want you to start to center the animation against this point or this point. You can define it whatever you want, but by default, it's towards the center. So if you go ahead and do this, all it's doing is we're doing another keyframe. And so I'm saying, hey, when I hover on the link, I want my SVG in its entirety to perform this in 1.5 seconds once. And my ease in and out is it's the timing of how fast I want you to go through this. That means I want you to start slow, accelerate, and then slow down again. It's a shorthand for one of the Bezier curves that's already built into CSS. So if I do that, it's great, but that's kind of janky looking. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and move these salt and pepper shakers independently and have them rotate towards each other. But the SVG for my salt and pepper shaker is kind of long and kind of clunky and kind of gross to look at. So let's go ahead and separate it out, because what we can do in SVGs is go ahead and add what's called a group. So it's a G tag. And that's essentially, if you think of a div in CSS, it's kind of, but not really what this is doing. It allows you to create something that you can reference, and it'll reference everything inside of it. If you're using Illustrator, if you create layers and have named layers in your file, it will automatically put groups where those layers exist. And it will also name them as the way you've named your layers. So in order to make reading complex files easier when you're exporting out of Illustrator, naming your layers and making sure your layers make sense for the objects that you have in your SVG is really, really helpful, because it will do this for you. So we have our two groups, right? And so I'm going to specifically focus on Mr. Salt. And I'm going to give Mr. Salt our keyframe, the exact same one I did for the SVG, but instead of rotating the SVG, I'm just going to rotate Salt. And instead of rotating from the middle, this is what I'm going to get. Because I'm now in an SVG. And so I've got some fun behaviors, because our animation, instead of starting from the center, is going to start from the top left-hand corner, because everything in an SVG starts from the top left-hand corner. So what's happening is, instead of rotating from a center of 50%, 50% in the center like we were seeing in normal CSS, inside of the SVG, what's happening is, even if your CSS is in your normal CSS file, because it's an element that is inside of the SVG, we're going to see that what the rotation does is it takes the entire bit and rotates it from 0, 0, which is here. rather than from 50%, 50%. So we have to now explicitly tell it, you know what, that transform origin on that group, right? Because we're dealing with our group salt, right? We want that to be 50-50, even though technically it is the default in CSS. You still have to explicitly say it when you're dealing with an element that is inside of an SVG. So now if I do that, my salt and pepper shakers can come and shake salt and pepper by their onesies like they were supposed to, instead of being out in left field somewhere. Any questions about that? Since we have some people that are not quite familiar with animations, I want to make sure that I'm not going through it too fast. Yeah? Okay, we're moving on. Okay. So now we're going to get to the adding functionalities part of this whole shindig. So adding functionality is the really fun part. Animations, honestly, is related to, it's a skill that can be honed, and they're really, really fun, and I love doing them in the SVGs because I can put all of this inside of the SVG itself, and I'm not having to mess with multiple layers of images on top of each other and grossness, but it's super fun. So that's something I definitely recommend playing with because yay, fun. Okay, so we're gonna add some functionality. Our little sidebar is kind of cute, but let's say we want this to be for kids, and so we want to be able to link back to an article about, for each of our ingredients, we have pumpkins and potatoes and sweet potatoes and carrots and broth and salt and pepper. And we want to make sure that all of those pieces inside of our side nav can be tabbed to and can link to their respective Wikipedia pages. And so the cool thing about a link in an SVG is that the anchor tag is a perfectly legitimate legal tag inside of an SVG. So you can simply go into your code, into your SVG code, go ahead and add your link to surround whatever the, go and put your link around whatever path, whatever, you could even put it around the group if you wanted, to where you go. You can do normal target links, you can do your rel no openers, you can put your ARIA labels. Those are going to be really important, especially since in my case, I don't necessarily have text, right? We're dealing with potatoes here. It's just the number 3. There's no real indication that I'm talking about potatoes if somebody's just tabbing through the links. So I definitely want to put an ARIA label there. If my SVG has text, we're perfectly a-okay. So that's why, as you can see over here, I'm hovering over my broth. And we can see that I have because I have, here's where the link starts. Here's my path for my broth. Mr. Broth is down here. And I've given it, I've actually put text in there. You can see that it actually finds content of 4 because it is a text element. That's one of the normal tags you can have in SVGs. I didn't cover it when I was explaining how they work because you just put text in it. You tell it where in the world it's going to go, and then you put text in it. But it has actual text, so we're good to go. As you can see, our accessibility tree very much finds it, knows that it's a link, tells me it's focusable. I'm good to go, right? So it just works, nothing to do, nothing to play with. Perfectly fine, perfectly legit. And this is me using it. If you remember correctly, I have this imported as an object. This will work just the same if you're importing inline. If you have it as an image, it doesn't matter that the link is in there, it will not work. It will not click. It will pretend that it does not exist at all because image has no with the image tag, we don't have any interactivity. So in order to do anything in this, basically from what I'm going to talk from now until pretty much the end, you have to be either inline or in an object tag. Those are the only 2 ways to make it work. I think it might work in an iframe. I've never tried because don't use iframe, use object. I can even add JavaScript if I really wanted to. The thing is, we are SVG is the code for SVG is technically XML. So inside of your Java and your script tag, you're going to want to do this CData thing. Otherwise, you're going to get collisions with your XML, especially when it comes to brackets and things, or try to put a greater than or a less than in there and you don't have your CData, and it's going to crash all the things. So in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, I generally just put my C data from the get-go and go ahead and do my thing. Just like standard old anywhere JavaScript, you can put an onClick on just about anything, and it will go ahead and do what an onClick you think it do. So right now I put an onClick on my little leaf. So could you like make JS in the SVG that you can click on and it changes color? Absolutely, absolutely you can. Because instead of basically, if instead in this particular code, instead of it opening an alert that says Bon Appetit in it, I could totally have that say go fetch whatever ID and then change the CSS on it. I could absolutely do that. Now the problem with this though is that for those of you who have seen my accessibility talks, do we put on clicks on things that are not buttons? The answer is no, we do not, because otherwise we don't get focus, we don't get tab index correctly, we don't, the screen readers and other assistive devices do not know that it is a button, and we end up with issues. As you can see from the accessibility readout here, it has no clue that the thing is clickable at all. So we need to fix that. Because we want to make sure that people can tab to it. We want to make sure that people using assistive technologies and or screen readers or even things like Alexas and Cortanas and everything know that there's a button there, right? We want to make sure that that works. So to do that, we have to use what's called a foreign object. A foreign object allows me to take normal HTML and shove it into my SVG. Now, two things about foreign objects. One, when you're using, if you're importing your image as object, you will need to deal with namespacing. That's why I had to go ahead and re-put on this a namespace. If you are inline, you do not need to do that. The other part about objects is that foreign objects, if you reopen an image that has a foreign object in most graphic systems, so like Illustrator, all those fun ones, it will not recognize the foreign object. It will not do anything with this foreign object. If you try to use this as an image, again, it will not know what to do with that foreign object and will simply not render it up. So once you get into foreign object territory, you are pretty much going to have to be importing this as an object or as a or inline. But now I can do, because the cool thing about SVGs is that anchor tags were perfectly legitimate tags that you could just use. Buttons, unfortunately, are not. So, and do not exist in the SVG spec. So we got to make sure to try to shoehorn one in there, and we're going to use object for that. So same as most things, we got to place our foreign object. Like I said earlier, everything about an SVG is positioned absolute. So we go figure out where the position of our little leaf was, and that is where the position of our little leaf was. You might be tempted to do a get element by ID and do get bounding box to do that. In SVGs, there's a handful of intricacies with the JavaScript. Instead of bounding box, it's going to be bbox. So be aware that some of those kind of utility things that you can get for with JavaScript are a little different and have little different syntaxes in SVG. But generally, when I'm doing something like that, and I want the position for the x, the y, and my height and width, what I will go ahead and do is whatever element I want to put this foreign object on top of, I'm going to go ahead and go and get the bbox for it. That way I have my coordinates and I can move along. You will not be putting the image in there. You're going to be putting your interactivity piece in here. Okay, so this is going to come and lay itself above my image. Now that doesn't mean that clicking the button can't do something, can't have an interaction with that image, but this is going to lay on top of the image, and that's going to be the clicky bit. So we're going to create a dumb button. It's going to have an on click, and we're going to go ahead and open the same alert box that says Benedict. So now if we look at our accessibility tree again, we're fine because we now have a button. We now have tab index. We're now focusable. We're good. And we can interact nicely with our thing. So now I can click it, I'm good. I can tab to it, I'm good. Everything is happening beautifully, right? I can tab to it, it's tabbed to it. I don't have a very good hover on there, but everything's working. The next, what you will run into, however, with SVGs also, because again, position absolutely everything means that our tab indexes are going to be, and our focus order is going to be a little wonky. So we got to fix that. And so part of that is, that's part of the spec. It's a A-level specification, so it's something you definitely want to make sure you're doing. And that means that generally speaking, in in Western America, in English, wow, I can't talk. In English, where we write from left to right, we want to make sure that, and read things generally speaking from top to bottom, we want to make sure that our as we tab through things in our application, that we're going from top left to bottom right. So what happens in our application when we do that? So far, so good. So far, so good. So far, so good. Except remember that button? Now it's randomly in the set of things, even though it's part of a little bindy thing. That's not good. So how are we going to help that happen? Well, what we really want is for when you're going down the vine, right, that it goes in order as we're going down our vine. When we're doing an SVG, what happens is whatever the first thing that you create is going to go on top, and then you create something else and it's going to lay itself on top. And then you create something else and it's going to go on top. And then, you know, in terms of, think of it in terms of layers, right? And one more, and one more. So what happens in this case is this first link is first on the list and the second link is second on the list. However, first link is positioned down here, and second link is positioned down here. So from a code perspective, this one's first, this one's second. But from a visual perspective, they're flip-flopped. What happens is our tab index is going to follow the code. So when I go down and try to tab through it, it's going to do this one first and this one second. Now remember the rule about top left to bottom right? That's not going to work for us. We need to flop that. Now, sometimes you can just change the order of the code because it works in terms of there's no overlap, there's no group issues, there's no whatever. Sometimes you'll have to use tab index in order to reassign tab order. That makes sense? So it really depends on how your SVG is constructed, how it's and how complex it is. In this particular case, I could just move the second link. Well, they both say first link, it should say second link on the bottom one. I could just move them both to the bottom and have them be in the correct order and it just work. But some of the more complex SVGs, that would not actually work out for because of, again, this whole layering thing. So let's take a look at our finalized application, right? We just did a bunch of stuff, and let's take a look at how it looks. So, so to fix our tab indexy thing in our app, what I ended up having to do, here's our pretty file. Our fall SVGs are site now. What I ended up having to do is go ahead and put tab indexes on our stuff so we have 1, 2, 3, etc. And our button, which is down here somewhere. Here's our foreign object. Went ahead and got its tab index for. So that's how we solved it in this particular case. So for our HTML, I think I can just do it that way. It's not a very good preview. But we end up having, this is not going to give me what I want. There we go. So now we have, what we've been able to do is, I'm not going to use my mouse. You can see the cursor in the middle. I can tab through my entire vine, and it will take me places by just using my keyboard, which is cool. And I can also open my theme, which is cool. And I can also have on hover animations that, you know, kind of do stuff as I'm hovering, and that's how I'm getting that interaction. So, this guy ends up being an object because I don't need to interact to and from these two pieces, right? this can kind of interact all on its own. These guys, since they're responding to what's happening in the link, I have inline so that they can do their fancy little thing. And so now we have a super cool, super cute little pumpkin thing. Anything while I have the code and the demo up that you guys wanted to see? Okay. Well, if you want to play, wrong direction. So what have we covered so far? We have covered loading. There we go. We've covered what SVGs are, how they're constructed, how to import them to do what we need them to do, some of the challenges in using them, how to add functionality in them, and some of the accessibility concerns of using them. And so if you guys want to find the code, slides and code respectively, or playing around with them, I do have all of this on GitHub if you guys want to play. And I will take any questions if you have them. Does SVG have origins from PostScript? I have no idea. Maybe. I honestly don't know. Oh, yeah, I can give the GitHub back again. Oh, there you go. The actual pumpkin soup, by the way, if you try that recipe, it actually works. I make it for my kids all day. So JS inside of SVG, you don't see very often, but it is super cool. Also, if you're dealing with, if you have an inline, you can actually keep your JS with your other JS. So unless you're really wanting to be able to, like it really depends on the use case. I end up moving my JS into my I do a lot of Angular, so I end up keeping my JS with my Angular more often than I stick it in my SVG. And basically my component ends up being an inline SVG that I then put in the JS in the controller for. So it really just depends on the usage. But if you want to be able to have an image that you can distribute anywhere in any environment with its functionality with it, it's really cool for that. For animation purposes, I'll do a shameless plug. Architecting CSS was my latest CSS book and has an entire section on animations. So I have to shameless plug a little bit. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I will let you guys go figure out what you want to do for your next session. Not that you need my permission to do it anyway, but and I hope everybody has a great rest of the conference.